So welcome back from your break. Let's take a look at the concept check question and then talk about jaws. So how do the differences in the anatomy of lampreys and conodonts reflect the feeding methods of these animals? Well, remember, lampreys have two feeding methods. You have the parasitic lampreys that use their sucker mouth and the hardened parts inside their sucker mouth to rasp a hole in the side of the body of the fish they're preying on so they can suck the juices out of the body. If they're non-parasitic lampreys, then they are filter feeders, and they're very much of a larval form that resembles the lancelets and the larval forms of the tunicates. So they are filter feeders, and so they are drawing food particles out of the water and filtering them out using their pharyngeal slits. The conodonts, remember, have those hardened dental elements in their throats and in their mouths that allow them to break up large food particles. There is a suggestion that they may actually use them to grab onto the prey that they're consuming, so that they can impale them with these dental elements, to use them sort of grasping features or harpoon-like features to grab onto the larger animal or larger food particle that they're going to ingest, and they can use these hard parts to slice it up into smaller components that can then be processed through the digestive tract. So it allows them to be much more efficient predators because of their ability to ingest larger particles of food and break it down into smaller units. They don't have to filter feed. So let's move on and take a look at the origin of jaws. So the origin of jaws lies with the mineralization that follows the mineralization of the mouth parts, the development of those dental elements that the conodonts possess, or the external bony plates that other jawless vertebrates produce to protect themselves from probably the conodonts. When we look at the two types of vertebrates, the jawless vertebrates, which used to be known as agnathostomes, meaning a lack of jaws, are limited in number. The extant members of the jawless vertebrates is just the hagfish and the lampreys. All other vertebrates are jawed vertebrates, the gnathostomes. And what accompanies the emergence of the jawed condition is a duplication of the Hox genes cassettes or clusters again. So remember, the origin of jawless vertebrates from the invertebrates is correlated with a duplication of the one cluster of Hox genes in all invertebrates to give rise to two clusters of Hox genes in the jawless vertebrates. When we transition from the jawless vertebrate condition to the jawed vertebrate condition, we see another doubling of the Hox gene clusters from 2 to 4. And there seems to be a very positive correlation with this doubling up of the Hox genes and the origin of jaws. So just exactly what is the formal origin of jaws? Well, when we start looking at the evolution or the development of the embryological jawed body plan, we see that it's associated with tissue that, if the organism is aquatic, is going to evolve into gills. If the organism is not aquatic, then those structural elements evolve into other features. But some of the structural elements that seem to have their origin as associated structures with the pharyngeal slits migrate forwards and become the upper and lower jaw, plus structures that are supporting the upper and lower jaw. Now, when you look at the vast majority of aquatic vertebrates that possess gills, there are 5 pairs of gills associated with 5 supportive structures. And those are known as gill arches and gill rods. And you can see them laid out here. There are 5 sets of structures that are supporting the gills. Oops. Well, let me fire up the pen again. So you have these 5 sets of gill rods or gill arches that support the gills. And this is very typical. You may not see them as 5 sets of gills because in many bony fish, these are covered by a flap of skin called an operculum. But in many sharks, you can actually see the 5 pairs of gills on the side of the head. But we also know that there are sharks that have 6 pairs of gills and there are sharks that have 7 pairs of gills. So it would appear that the number of gills was much greater early on in the origin of vertebrates. And certainly when we look at the jawless vertebrates, the number of pharyngeal slits is greater than 5. And so what we think has happened is that some of the pharyngeal slits that were used for food filtering with the origin of hardened parts in the mouth were then co-opted, and the supporting structures, not the gills themselves, but the supporting structures, what are now gill arches and gill rods, migrated forwards to give rise to the structures that would be mineralized and give rise to the upper and lower jaw bones. And there's even some vestigial evidence for that in terms of the origin of the jaws during embryological development. So if you take your finger and rub it just gently on the point of your jaw, many of you are going to feel a slight depression. Some of you may feel a larger depression, but you're going to feel a little depression there. And that depression is a vestige of the fact that the 2 sides, the 2 lower jaw bones, fused together to form the jaw structure, which is evidence of their derivation from 2 separate structures associated with gills on either side of the head. This is more easily seen in the upper jaw in individuals that have the condition known as cleft palate or cleft lip. Again, the upper jaw bones are supposed to fuse together to give rise to the palate. And if that fusion does not take place correctly, you get a cleft palate, or externally, you get a cleft lip. But this is a vestigial evidence of the fact that the jaw bones are derived from features that were once on opposite sides of the head performing different functions, but have been co-opted into forming the jaw structure. Now, it also appears that there may have been substantially more supporting structures than we see evidence today. And it appears that at least 1 pair of supporting structures were lost completely, the most posterior pair, before the jaws developed. A pair of gill rods, most anteriorly, not most posteriorly, most anteriorly, were lost completely before the jaws formed. Yeah, I think I'll go here. One of the interesting things that you learn when you take an anatomy class, particularly if you do a dissection of a number of different animals, if you do a dissection of a fish or a shark, and you do dissections of mammals, if you're lucky, or you take the right anatomy class, you may even have an opportunity to dissect a human cadaver. When you take a look at the nerves, particularly the nerves that drive the upper and lower jaw in mammals, you find that it takes a big loop down into the chest and then back up to the jaws again. And this is simply a reflection of the origin of the jaws as derived from the gill arches that were located back in the neck, or what would have been, I mean, fish don't have a neck, but hopefully you understand what I'm talking about, that region of the body that that we now refer to the neck was actually associated with the gills and associated with the pectoral girdle, what is now our collarbone and shoulder bones, to which our arms are attached. And so the nerves that control the gill arches are the nerves now that control the jaws, but because the jaws were once part of the pharyngeal clefts but have migrated forwards, the nerves that are associated with them take this big loop down through the neck and then come back up to drive the jaw, to still be associated with the jaw. It's just a reorganization of a basic body plan that first originates in the fish and then gets modified and jury-rigged with the origin of terrestrial tetrapods and the origin of primates and eventually humans. We're still utilizing the same nerve sets and the same muscle sets. They're just being reorientated and repositioned, not readapt or utilizing different sets of nerves, using the same sets of nerves and muscles, just repositioning them. And so you see features that are not necessarily always logical, but when you think in terms of evolutionary adaptation, they make perfect sense. So those of you who are planning to go on to medical school, when you start dissecting a human cadaver in medical school in anatomy, you will likely have this pointed out to you. And you'll see these features that don't make logical sense until you start thinking evolutionarily and remind yourself where the origins of these tissues lie as products of evolutionary adaptation. Then it makes perfect sense as to why they should be where they are and why they take the particular route to get to where they're going that they take. So other features of gnathostomes, other than the jaws, which is what the term gnathostome actually refers to. You can see here that there's the mention of the duplication of Hox genes, already covered that. There is the mineralization of the internal skeleton, so the displacement of the cartilage and replacement by bony material. Paired appendages, so you see the origin of the tetrapod condition in the form of the pectoral girdle with the pair of fins that are attached to that, the so-called pectoral fins, and then the pelvic girdle and the pelvic fins. And all gnathostomes, whether they be cartilaginous or bony, so sharks, rays, bony fish, amphibians, terrestrial tetrapods in general, have these pairs of appendages, fins in the aquatic organisms, limbs in the non-aquatic. The brain undergoes some further adaptation to become capable of better coordination of body activity, cataloging, and there's a word that I want and I can't think of it right now. Coordinating, I guess, collaborating and coordinating the sensory inputs with the motor, the motor neurons and the motor side of the body, so that the animal can respond to the sensory inputs. Then in all aquatic jawed vertebrates or gnathostomes, there is a unique organ called the lateral line that is sensitive to vibrations in the water. So sharks and rays have it, fish have it, even the tadpoles of amphibians have it. The juvenile forms of amphibians have this lateral line. Again, an organ that is unique to aquatic jawed vertebrates, even in their larval stage, that allows them to sense vibrations in the water. And so for the predators, it's a way of identifying prey through the vibrations that they produce. And for the prey anathostomes, a way to sense the presence of predators in the water and to be able to respond to those. So when we look at the fossil evidence for jawed vertebrates, there are some pretty impressive jawed vertebrates that show extensive mineralization both internally and externally. So you have a photo of this animal in the textbook. So this is the photo from the textbook, and you can see that this creature has an extensive mineralization, and this is all external. This is bony plating externally. And you can see that the jaw-like apparatus consists of a pair of bony blades that come together in a scissor-like fashion. And this would make it an extremely impressive predator. And it would be able to easily slice large amounts of flesh off any prey item that it came in contact with. Even the eye is heavily armored to protect it. And some of these individuals were quite large. So you can see the skull here is about 1/2 meter in length. So 1/2 meter makes it around 2 feet in length. Some of the largest individuals may have been up to 10 feet in length, pretty impressive predators. I had the good fortune to be able to see one of these skulls. And I'm not sure whether it's the same one that the book has, because the eye socket lacks the armor plating that you could see here in the textbook image. But this was in the Museum of Natural History in Paris. And it is very, very impressive. It is quite a large bony protective element on this predatory animal. And why this is important is because these animals lived at around the same time as some of the earliest ancestors of amphibians were starting to develop limbs. And it is perhaps the presence of these animals that drove the ancestors of early amphibians into the shallows and eventually led to the adaptation of their fin system into supportive structures that would evolve ultimately over time into limbs that would allow them to better utilize the shallow freshwater environments that they were moving around in. Because we also know that the earliest ancestors of modern fish evolved in freshwater, not in salt water. They would, some of them would subsequently migrate out into salt water and give rise to the large numbers of saltwater fish. But the earliest ancestors of jawed vertebrates in the form of fish actually evolved in freshwater, not in saltwater. And so there are some parallel ideas going on here that are worth mentioning, just so that you're aware of why animals like this may have been significant, not just because they were significant in terms of mineralization of the skeleton, but also in terms of the effect that they might have on other animals around them and how they may have driven the evolution of other animals around them in directions that ultimately we start to see in terms of the origin of terrestrial tetrapods. So these are pretty impressive predators, you have to admit that. So in terms of modern aquatic jawed vertebrates, there are two major clades, the chondrichthyans and again, I'm struggling at times to remember the name. So you have the chondrichthyans, these are the cartilaginous fish, and the osteichthyans, which are the bony fish. And the bony fish are then broken up into a number of smaller clades, which we'll get to. So what we need to remember about the chondrichthyes, the cartilaginous fish, is that their origin is from an ancestor that had a fully mineralized skeleton. So the cartilaginous state, or the cartilaginous condition, is a juvenile condition. That. So it's a really good example of pedomorphosis. Remember, that's retention of a juvenile characteristic into adulthood and sexual maturity. And as I mentioned right back at the beginning when we were talking about the phylogeny of vertebrates, some sharks have a vestigial trace of the mineralized skeleton in the form of a small bony structure at the base of the dorsal fin. That's the large fin on the back of the shark. That's the one that in movies like Jaws is the evidence of the shark swimming under the water, because the dorsal fin is the one that pokes up through the surface and glides through the water and is evidence of the presence of the shark underneath. So for some sharks, there is a vestigial piece of bone sitting underneath the dorsal fin. So when we think in terms of the cartilaginous fish, because they are fish, you have the sharks and the rays as one clade, and then a small group of fish called the ratfish that are also cartilaginous fish. You don't see these very often because these are deep water fish living below 1,000 feet in the water column, so you probably wouldn't encounter these very much. So here you can see a typical shark in the form of a black-tipped reef shark. Dorsal fins, the pectoral fins, the pelvic fins and the pectoral fins. So you've got the pectoral girdle, equivalent of our collarbone and shoulder bones, and then the pelvic girdle, the equivalent of our pelvis. The cartilaginous skeleton gives them a certain amount of flexibility, but they're not as flexible as they might seem, because cartilage is typically fairly rigid. There are some sharks that have the ability to turn and fold their bodies a little bit more than others, particularly the sharks that belong to the hammerhead or shovelhead family of sharks that have the large extensions at the anterior end of their body that usually move their eyes out. So you've probably seen the typical hammerhead shark. The reason why they have that is because in underneath the jaws of the shark, make sure the pen is working here again. So in this region of the shark, there is a unique set of sensory organs called ampules of Lorenzini. These are sensors that can detect electrical signals from muscle contraction. And all sharks have them, but in the case of the hammerhead and shovelhead sharks, because of that enlargement of their head, they have a larger network of these sensory organs, and it allows them to pick up the very, very weak electrical signals that come from the muscle contractions of mollusks and other animals buried underneath the sand, which is what these sharks specialize in feeding on. And so you have the ampules of Lorenzini that allow them to detect these. They also have the lateral line. So the lateral line as an organ runs down the body. So that would be the lateral line. And there's one of these organs on each side of the body. And then you'll notice some structures up here that look very much like nostrils. They are sensory organs, but they sense the presence of chemicals in the water. And you'll notice that they're on opposite sides of the snout, so they provide directional information. If the source of the chemical is directly in front of the shark, both organs get sensed it equally. If it's off to one side, one organ senses it more strongly than the other side, provide them with directional evidence. And you may have heard that sharks can detect the presence of blood in the water from a great distance. These are the organs that allow them to do that. The difference between sharks and rays: a ray has a dorsoventrally flattened body. Its mouth is on the underside of the body, and the pectoral fins are greatly enlarged compared to the pelvic fin. So this is the pectoral fin. And this little structure is the pelvic fin. So you can see that there is an exaggerated pectoral fin that makes up part of the apparatus that allows the ray to swim. And most rays spend a lot of time at or near the bottom of the ocean. The exceptions are the largest rays, like the manta rays, that filter feed and feed on krill. And this is one of the most remarkable things. The largest rays, the manta rays, and the largest fish, the whale shark and the basking shark, are all filter feeders feeding on krill. Yes, they're predatory, but they feed on the smallest animals in the ocean, the krill, the little shrimp that make up the krill. And so the largest fish feed on the smallest animals. Kind of ironic there. So here are some features that are associated with sharks. Their body plan, their body form is a perfect body form for moving swiftly through the water. We describe it as a torpedo shape, but that in fact is incorrect. The shape of a shark's body shape is more like this. So it's not really torpedo shape, but this is a perfect adaptation for moving swiftly through the water, and all sharks have this basic body plan. The pectoral fins and the pelvic fins extend out. And if you look at them from side on, they look exactly like the wing on an airplane. So they actually provide lift to allow the shark to stay in the water column, because they do not have neutral buoyancy. They have negative buoyancy, meaning that they sink if they stop swimming. So their body form, both in their overall body plan and the shape of their fins, provides them with lift to allow them to stay in the body, in the water column. They are all carnivores, even those that are feeding on krill are carnivores. They have a very short digestive tract, but as carnivores, they need to be able to digest meat and muscle tissue. So that means they need to have a slightly longer digestive tract than their body allows. So they have a structure called a spiral valve that actually provides a larger digestive surface area inside the digestive tract, so that they can process their food. And we've talked about their senses already, so we can move on from here. Sharks all practice internal fertilization. It can be quite a violent process. If you want to see just how violent, there are plenty of YouTube videos that demonstrate just how violent shark mating truly is. But they give birth in 3 different ways. The female can actually lay eggs in a I hesitate to call it a shell, but in a sac-like arrangement that provides it with protection. It's typically semi-transparent, so if you put a light behind it, you can actually see the little embryonic shark developing inside the egg. So these are known as oviparous because the baby sharks hatch out of this egg structure external from the body of the external from the mother. Ovoviviparous sharks retain the egg internally, but the embryos are supported by the presence of yolk in the egg, and then the young are born live. So that's ovoviviparous. And then you have viviparous, which is a situation where the embryo not only gets nutrition from yolk, but also from a placenta-like structure that gets nourishment from the mother's body system. And this is the situation in the case of the great white sharks. And this is the reason why pregnant female sharks are particularly voracious predators, because they are supporting their young. And in fact, the predatory behavior of great white sharks begins while they're still in the uterus, because the largest of the young sharks, and there's usually multiple sharks developing inside the uterus, the largest of them becomes a carnivore, or becomes a boy, I'm having too many senior moments trying to recall the right term. It'll come to me, but it turns around and it eats all its siblings inside the uterus. And so it gets some of its first whole meal or solid food meals in the form of eating all its siblings, so that it is the only young shark developing inside the uterus of the mother. She still is a very voracious predator because she still needs to support this young, but it has eaten all its siblings as a way of removing the competition, providing it unique access to its mother's support, and also providing it with a meal in the process. As we will see in a number of other organisms, most notably reptiles and birds, the reproductive tract and the digestive tract all empty into a common opening called the cloaca. So all waste in the form of liquid waste, solid waste, and also access to the reproductive tract is via this common opening, the cloaca. In the case of bony fish, these are the osteichthyans or osteichthyes. Because terrestrial tetrapods are derived from a common ancestor with osteichthyes, all terrestrial vertebrates are included within this clade. So osteichthyes includes terrestrial vertebrates. If you take a look at all the osteichthyans, these are the bony fish. They have a mineralized internal skeleton. They have a organ that is derived from the air-breathing organ, the lung that the common ancestor of all fish, cartilaginous and bony, possessed, an air-breathing organ that some bony fish retain, whether they be ray-finned fish or members of the lobed fin fish, which we'll get to in a few moments. In others, the air-breathing sac is modified to provide buoyancy, but the connection to lungs is still there because the gases that fill the swim bladder are extracted out of the bloodstream or returned to the bloodstream when the gas content of the swim bladder needs to be reduced, because the fish can control how much gas is in the swim bladder to provide neutral buoyancy. In other words, they don't need to swim to stay in the water column. They can hover in the water column by adjusting their buoyancy, by extracting gas out of their circulatory system or returning gas to the circulatory system. They do gas exchange through gills, typically 5 pairs of gills, but some have 4 pairs of gills, all covered by a flap of tissue supported by bone called the operculum. So you should be familiar with this body plan of the bony fish and also the body plan of a cartilaginous fish on the basis of the caudate lab that you completed with the dissection of a bony fish and the dissection of a dogfish, which is a cartilaginous fish, member of the shark family. So you can see here the swim bladder, which is derived from a lung-like organ that some fish still retain. Some fish actually have both a swim bladder and a lung-like feature for capturing gases from the air. So they have 2 separate organs for that purpose. Complete digestive tract, as we would expect, postanal tail, lateral line because they're aquatic organisms, dorsal nerve cord with the brain, and 3 components of the brain: forebrain, midbrain, and hindbrain, as defined by most neurobiologists in terms of compartmentalizing the brain, at least morphologically, if not functionally. Common opening to the 3 systems: the digestive tract, the waste excretion system, and the reproductive tract. So the common opening, the cloaca. 2 pairs of fins, pectoral fin and pelvic fin. So you've got the pelvic girdle and the pectoral girdle, the beginnings of the tetrapod condition. So within the Osteichthyes, there are 3 clades. The Actinopterygii are the ray-fin fish. These are the ones that you are most familiar with because these are the ones that we typically eat as a food resource. The fins are supported by bony extensions called rays, hence the name ray-finned fish. So here's some examples of different types of ray-finned fish. And yes, eels and seahorses are in fact fish. A seahorse is a highly modified example of a long and slender fish family. I've forgotten for the moment the name of that family, but the seahorse has simply adapted that long, thin body plan to something that is somewhat horse-like, I guess, in terms of the shape of the head. What is unique about the seahorses is that the males provide the care of the fertilized eggs and the newly hatched baby seahorses. It is the males that provide the care, so it's paternal care, not maternal care. And eels, of course, as I've mentioned earlier, are also members of the ray-finned fish. Again, a very highly modified fish body plan, but nonetheless a ray-finned fish body plan. Then we have 2 lines of fish that belong to a clade called Sarcopterygii. These are the lobed fin fish. these have a structure that is more akin to the structure of limbs. In fact, the beginning of the limb structure is seen within the lobed fin. So rather than having fine, narrow rays of bones supporting the fins, these have more defined bones that show the beginnings of limb-like structure, particularly in the pectoral fins, not so much in the pelvic fins, but very much so in the pectoral fins. There are two clades that lie within Sarcopterygi, the coelacanths, known as Actinistia, and the lungfish, known as Dipnoi. And then, of course, all the terrestrial tetrapods belong to this clade as well, because they are descendants of a common ancestor, not so much with the coelacanths, but with the lungfishes. So the coelacanths are referred to today as living fossils because until 1938, the only evidence of coelacanths was in fossils that date back to around 350 million years ago. But then in 1938, a dead coelacanth was found on the deck of a fishing trawler based in East London on the east coast of South Africa. And of course, if you've got a dead coelacanth, somewhere there must be living coelacanths. They were subsequently found living in deep trenches off the east coast of Africa around Madagascar and the Comoros Islands. That was the first species of coelacanths. The second species of coelacanths was found living again in deep water trenches off the coast of some of the northern islands of the Indonesian archipelago. Again, first discovered as a dead coelacanth in a fish market by an American biologist and his wife, who were on their honeymoon in Indonesia and decided to check out the markets one day and found a dead coelacanth for sale in the market, which would be unusual because coelacanths are not considered to be good to eat because they're very oily and don't taste terribly good. But the gentleman recognized exactly what he was looking at and realized that there must be another species of coelacanths somewhere in Indonesia, because of course Indonesia and Africa are separated by many thousands of miles in the Indian Ocean. And so again, if you've got a dead coelacanth in a fish market, there must be living coelacanths somewhere nearby. And subsequently, he was able to see a living coelacanth very briefly before it died, because one was captured. He offered a reward for a living coelacanth. One was captured. Unfortunately, it did not survive the process and it died. But it confirmed that there were living coelacanths around. And now we recognize that there are two species of coelacanths. You can find many videos of coelacanths because biologists have become quite excited to try and confirm their hypotheses that had been developed about the nature of coelacanths and their relationship to terrestrial tetrapods, now that there were living examples of the fish. Many of those hypotheses were negated, but one hypothesis does kind of still hold water, in that the fins of the coelacanths are not used for walking across the bottom, but when you watch a coelacanth use its pectoral and pelvic fins to swim, it moves them in the same fashion as a terrestrial tetrapod walking. So if you think about how you walk, when you move your right leg forwards, you swing your left arm forwards. When you move your left foot forwards, you swing your right arm forwards. And that's essentially how the coelacanth swims, using its pectoral and pelvic fins. So you see evidence of a tetrapod gait, the way it walks, in the movement of a coelacanth's fins when it swims. So, time for another break. We will come back and look at the origin of the of terrestrial tetrapods after this break, but let's take a break for a moment and take a look at this concept check question. What derived characteristics do cartilaginous and bony fish have in common? What features are unique to bony fish? See you on the other side of the break with the answer.